Welcome, everybody. I think people are still filing in. We're just going to give it a few minutes and then we will begin.
Do we know how many participants?
In the box on the corner, we'll tell you.
Okay.
But we're live. I wouldn't want to be the first Jewish event in history to start early. I would ruin it for the others and get in
Because
trouble.
we have a Swede on here, that's why.
I'm German.
Because we're all so punctual. Well, I think it's 7 in Israel at least.
Wow. And we have 108, 110 and growing participants already.
Yeah, I think we'll give it a minute. I started at 1 minute after. There we go. So welcome, survivors, friends, to the first Holocaust Survivor Day. My name is Jonathan Ornstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center of Krakow, the founder of Holocaust Survivor Day. We have an illustrious panel that I will introduce in a few minutes, but first, some friends around the world have sent us messages. The first one is from Ambassador Ronald S. Lauder, President of the World Jewish Congress.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this important commemoration. I've been thinking about this and why we should focus on the survivors of the Shoah. The world has always honored the great heroes of World War II, the brave Allied soldiers who defeated Nazism, were heroes who, at great cost, freed a suffering humanity. The Marines who stormed those terrible beaches in the Pacific and freed millions throughout Asia, again at great cost, were all heroes as well. But there's another group of heroes that we seldom talk about, and that is why this Holocaust Survivor Day is so important. I've always believed that the people who survived the horrors of the concentration camps were heroes on two levels. First, these people lived through and witnessed some of the greatest horrors of all time. Beyond the obvious, the tortures, the deprivation, the terrible conditions, was the fact that they also lost their entire families. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and worst of all, children. But perhaps their most heroic chapter, and the one that people rarely recognize, is what they did after their liberation. Despite all the death that they witnessed, they left these camps not with revenge in mind, but determined to create new families and new life. In the face of the greatest death machine in human history, these people created life. Can there be anything more Jewish than this? Answering death with life? And they did this all so quietly that the rest of the world either didn't know about it, didn't understand what it took to do this, or perhaps people on the outside just took it for granted. This should never be taken for granted. Losing everything is terrible, and losing your loved ones is beyond comprehension. But in my opinion, the quiet determination to create new life is one of the most noble chapters in human history. It has been my greatest honor to get to know these people. I have met them at the camps when they returned for commemorations. I met them through the World Jewish Congress at our own events. I've come to know many of them. I want to share something personal with you. I've had the great honor of meeting many people in my life, kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers, celebrities and movie stars. I will tell you this, none are more noble than these Holocaust survivors. Today, we are losing them all too quickly, and soon there'll be no living witnesses to the Shoah, and the world will be the poorer for not having these outstanding people among us. This past year, we lost one survivor that I greatly respected, a quiet man named Roman Kent. At the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, Roman Kent was one of the main speakers. Like most of the people there, he lost almost his entire family. But he went on to create a successful life and new family. Quiet, dignified, he personified the nobility I spoke about. Roman Kent's words at the event have stayed with me over the years. I've quoted them often. I will quote them again. I'm quoting, "Do not let our past," said Roman Kent, "become our children's future." Let me repeat this. Do not let our past become our children's future. At a time when there's been terrible rise in anti-Semitism worldwide, Roman Kent's words are more important than ever. When Jews are attacked on the streets of Los Angeles and New York, Paris and London, Berlin and Malmö, when Israelis are attacked with over 4,000 missiles by a terrorist organization, and many people blame Israel for this, these words should carry a deeper meaning for all of us. While we celebrate these great people today, we must do everything in our power to make sure that their past will not be our children's future. This is up to all of us, and we must not fail this task. We owe it to Roman Kent, we owe it to Marian Tursky, and we owe this to all those heroic survivors. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lauder, for those powerful words. And now a message from Mark Wilf, Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Jewish Federations of North America.
I'm Mark Wilf, Chair of the Jewish Federations of North America. After surviving the Holocaust, my parents committed to building a vibrant state of Israel and a flourishing, caring Jewish community in North America. Survivors like my parents have taught us about resiliency and the strength of the human spirit. During the Holocaust, they fought back, cared for other Jews, and overcame the unthinkable. Afterwards, they raised families and built communities. Today, the Jewish Federations of North America works with the United States government, global partners, and philanthropists to help Holocaust survivors live with the comfort, dignity, and security they deserve. Every day, on Holocaust Survivors Day, we celebrate our survivors' commitment, contributions, and honor their legacy.
Thank you, Mark. And now we'll hear from Marcy Gringlas, co-founder and president of the Seed the Dream Foundation.
Hello, I am Marcy Gringlas, co-founder and president of See the Dream Foundation, and it is my privilege to be with you today on this momentous occasion. On this inaugural Holocaust Survivor Day, we honor and celebrate those that survived the unimaginable. My personal message to you, our treasured survivors, is that we remember, we are listening, we are here, you are not forgotten. And to the far too many survivors who are still struggling, even today, we say clearly, this should not be. We will continue to work to address these emergency needs collectively. I actually do not remember not knowing about the Holocaust. From the earliest age, when my father told me his story of survival from 3 concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dora-Nordhausen, and my mother shared her stories as a hidden child, I heard, felt, and understood the resilience of survivors and the importance, the significance of their legacy for my family, for the Jewish people, and for the world that we live in. As a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, I have seen the struggles that accompany the very meaning of survival and I have been awed by the strength of my parents and all of you who have had the courage to rebuild your shattered lives, to bear witness and tell your stories again and again so that we may listen to, learn from, and retell your stories to future generations. Like the ember from the ashes, you have been our spark. You have been our guiding light. You have become parents, teachers, doctors, scientists, lawyers, builders, and dreamers. It was just decades ago that you fought to keep alive, and we are in awe as we look at you today. The miracle of what is and what has been sustained takes my breath away every day. We, the second, third, and in our family now the fourth generation, strive to carry your legacy forward and ensure that the lessons you have taught us, the values you have instilled in us, live on. What better way than inaugurating this special day to symbolize the power of hope together with the value of memory for our families, for the Jewish people, for the world. We honor you, we cherish you, we celebrate you.
Thank you, Marcy, for those beautiful words. And now our friends from the Claims Conference, Gideon Taylor, President, and Gregg Schneider, Executive Vice President.
Hello, my name is Gideon Taylor, and I have the honor of serving as President of the Claims Conference. It's my privilege to be here today to help kick off this day honoring Holocaust survivors. Enabling survivors to live in comfort and with dignity is the mission of the Claims Conference. Survivors have endured humanity's worst, and it's not only our duty to ease their daily lives, it is our moral imperative. I see this day, this time set aside to celebrate the lives of the heroes of the Shoah as a natural extension of that mission. With anti-Semitism on the rise around the world, with the pandemic impacting mobility and accessibility, and Holocaust and denial and distortion climbing, Holocaust survivors need our support, our protection, and our reassurance now more than ever. To those of you who lived through the Shoah, you did not have the luxury of following your dreams or pursuing your education from an early age. Most of you were left without families, without homes, and often without country. But that did not stop you. In the wake of the most horrific injustice in human history, you picked up and carried forward, building your lives over again from the ashes of World War II. Symbolic events like the one we are marking here today ensure that you are recognized and honored for the example you have lived, and help us feel connected to our greater global community. But you have done so much more than just overcome hatred and adversity. You inspire us, you motivate us, and perhaps most importantly, you galvanize us as a collective to do more and to be better. I am honored to be part of this inaugural tribute today. And now I would like to introduce you to Gregg Schneider, my longtime colleague and friend and Executive Vice President of the Claims Conference.
Shalom, it's an honor to be here with you today. I have the great privilege of working with Holocaust survivors as part of my everyday life at the Claims Conference. But you know, this past year has been really difficult. Essentially, we've all been kept from living our regular lives. And of course, this includes Holocaust survivors. And while they're older and more frail, and certainly the most vulnerable population in the face of this pandemic, that hasn't been reflected in my conversations with individual survivors. My conversations over the past year have been dialogues of inspiration, of hope, and of determination. In short, they've been conversations of resilience, conversations in which the exact vulnerable population that I'm seeking to help ends up fortifying me. That is what I think of when I think of survivors, resilience. At the Claims Conference, it is our mission to ensure a measure of justice for Holocaust survivors, for you who lost so much in your early years and yet have spent decades building from the darkest of days. And even now, you continue to inspire by giving of yourselves, bearing witness, speaking in schools, even if it means reliving horrors, honoring the memories of those who were murdered, and trying to make the world a place with just a little less hate. You push forward, not just living your truth and sharing it daily with the world, but serving as a living example of strength and fortitude. You are resilience. Thank you for providing this living example of perseverance. Your contributions go far beyond what you can individually see and feel, and we are grateful for your guidance and inspiration you provide every day. It is your example that keeps us steadfast in our mission. We look forward to today's program featuring second and third generation panelists, scholars, and of course, Holocaust survivors. There can't ever be enough days on the calendar or time in the world dedicated to honoring you, our heroes of the Shoah, and your resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gideon and Gregg, and the other wonderful videos that we saw, really inspiring and moving. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Colette Avital, the chairperson of the Center of the Organizations of Holocaust Survivors in Israel. Stephen D. Smith, the Andrew J. and Erna Finzi Viterbi, executive director of chair of the USC Shoah Foundation. Rabbi Michael Paley, the senior scholar at JDC and Tarbut director, and Ulrika Citron, USC Shoah Foundation Next Generation Council member. Holocaust Survivor Day is a day meant to celebrate and honor survivors. A simple idea. And I want to thank the almost 100 organizations around the world who have now joined us, and all of those who in Israel and Hungary and Poland, Australia, the UK and the US, and many other places are honoring survivors in their communities. But above all, I want to thank the survivors for your strength and your optimism, and for showing us that tragedy can be overcome. And if that you can, then there's hope for the rest of us. I'd like to ask my panelists, and I have one question that I'll start really for all of you, which is, why a day for survivors, and what should this day accomplish? Not only for the survivors, who we hope to honor, but for the Jewish people and beyond. Colette, let me start with you.
Yes, thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you, and I really am happy and honored to be part of this. And it's true that it's long overdue, but and I'll say why. In Israel today, we have about 200,000 Holocaust survivors. I think there are about 400,000 Holocaust survivors around the world. And to be very honest, they were not treated well at the beginning, certainly in the first years of the independence of the State of Israel, when the mood was different, when one wanted to create a new kind of society, the brave new world, and they were looked upon sometimes with disdain and treated as if they had been the sheep led to be slaughtered. And even in terms of compensating them, it took many years before the government did. And basically, I think that for many years, they suffered not only from this injustice, but also because of the bureaucracy, which was really needed to get any kind of help, either from the State of Israel or from others, the German government and others. You had to prove, I'll give you one example of how humiliated people were when they said that they lost their parents in Auschwitz. They said, can you bring a death certificate? So those were things that were happening. And I think that today the attitude has changed. And I believe that first and foremost, to give them back their sense of dignity, to understand what they went through, to understand that it was not only brave in terms of having survived and what they survived and how they survived. But also we have to remember that many people fought and fought back. And we do not remember enough those pages of heroism of the people who fought with the partisans, of the people who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, of the young people who knew that the situation was lost and still got up, of the people who documented everything that was happening for the next generations to come. So I think we owe them a recognition, a long overdue recognition. I will add to that, to what Ronald Lauder said. I think it's also important to what they have done and contributed. 20% of the people who fought and died in the War of Independence of Israel were Holocaust survivors who came directly from the camps, had no training, just took the rifle in their hand and they fought for their new country. And over the years, I'm sure it's not only the case of Israel. Look around you, look around the world, what those people, those who were left, have contributed in science, in technology, in medicine, in literature, in the arts, in the economy of every country, certainly in Israel. So we owe them a debt of gratitude. I think in many ways, the state of Israel was born also because of them and for them. And therefore, I think that this is very important. And why is it also important? Because they educate in a way the next generations for other kinds of values, for a sense of values that we really need to pass on to the next generations, for human dignity and for the sanctity of human life, and for do not do to the other what has been done to you, and for solidarity and for resilience. So all these are values which they embody, which they symbolize. And I think the most important contribution they have today is in education. And I think this is one of the things that they do, and we need to continue doing. One more thing which I'd like to say, because I know my time is almost up. We here in Israel deal with Holocaust survivors and with their rights, and we continue to negotiate with the German government. And there's so many people, because of very strange kind of definitions, that have not had rights because they're not recognized as Holocaust survivors. But one of the things we do, and I suggest that we all think about it, is how do we shape the memory of the Holocaust? What exactly is the message? What is it that we want to continue to pass to the next generations? Is it going to be a simple page in history that people will either read or ignore? Or is it something more significant, the kind of heritage which they will leave behind them in the world, the kind of values that we want to leave behind us, the lessons that we've learned from the Holocaust? And I think if I understand and if I work with Holocaust survivors, and I'm a survivor myself, I haven't been in camps, but I have seen enough during the war, and I have suffered enough during the war, and so have my parents. I think that memory, the way we pass on memory, the way we shape memory, and it is up to us, is extremely important today, also because what we see today in many countries, especially in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, where a law is being passed while we're just talking, a very bad law which does not allow Holocaust survivors and others to get back their properties. Well, what we have to understand is that many of these countries are rewriting history, are embellishing their history. They present themselves as the victims, and we have to make sure that when the story is being told, it is not deformed, it is not rewritten. And this, I think, is our responsibility to the Holocaust survivors.
Thank you, Colette, for that absolutely comprehensive answer in many ways of describing the need for Holocaust Survivor Day and going way beyond. Stephen, I would ask you the same question. Why the need for a day for Holocaust survivors? What should the day accomplish? And what is the hope? That a day like this the impact that a day like this can have on both the Jewish world and really beyond the Jewish world?
Well, for me, Jonathan, this is about two things. It's about stopping one thing and starting another. We've got to stop saying that the survivors are all gone. We've got to stop writing them out of history. How many times do people say to me, oh, you work at the Shoah Foundation, what a shame, the survivors are all leaving. We've got to turn away from turning these individuals who are living, breathing, wonderful people and turning them into artifacts of history, like they are some sort of object that we look at from a distance and admire, and then just think that somehow or other they are departing, and then that will then be confined to history. These individuals are not confined to history. They are part of our community and they are part of our lives. And some of us, even in the field of Jewish Holocaust studies and in the Jewish community, make this error as well, that we think for some reason or other, because they're elderly and frail, that they are about to depart like some species that's about to become extinct. You know, we are all mortal and we're all going to leave this world at some time. But that's a journey that each of us takes in our own way and in our own time. So we've got to stop thinking about Holocaust survivors as a block of people and celebrate the individual lives, because every one of them has something to offer to them. Colette just reminded us that she's a Holocaust survivor. Look at the wonderful work she does and has been doing today in Israel with Holocaust survivors. And thank you, Colette, for all that you do. I think it's really not about death, it's about life. And we've got to stop talking about death, and we've got to live the best lives that we can and enjoy the time that we have together and make the best of it. Then we've got to start something. We have got to start saying thank you properly to this group of people and these individuals who have enriched our lives so well. And I want to thank you, Jonathan, for giving us the chance to do this, and Michael Berenbaum for establishing this day. We've got to start saying thank you for your resilience and your strength. Thank you for not hating, even though you had every reason to hate. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for the life that you have led. Thank you for the example that you have led throughout your now extended life. Thank you for giving back to our society. You have so many needs of your own and struggling to reestablish yourself in the world, and yet you give back to us. Thank you for that. Thank you for striving for justice. You had no justice, and yet you strive for justice in the world. And not only that for yourselves and your own families, but for those who are also going through other genocides and other crimes against humanity. I see you, I hear you, and how you strive for justice. Thank you for that. Thank you for shedding light in a world of darkness. You experienced the deepest darkness of humanity, and yet you bring light. The Shoah Foundation's motto is, we bring testimony to light. Actually, the reality is Holocaust survivors bring light through their testimony, and thank you for it. Thank you for your families that you created. We know how difficult that was, but look at what they bring. Look at what you bring as citizens of the world and all that your families have brought to our community, many of whom are on today, second and third generation. Thank you for telling your story. You know, without your story, we have nothing to take into the future, but your story brings light to our world today. Thank you for teaching our children. My children have no connection to the Holocaust. My family aren't Jewish, and yet there we have this beautiful enrichment. My children have like scores of grandparents, and they teach my children, but they teach all of our children through the education work they do. Thank you for being ambassadors to our world. Thank you for being ambassadors for the Jewish community and being out in the world, teaching and talking and bringing the substance of your life. Thank you for traveling thousands of miles every year to teach tens of thousands of children every year. We take for granted that these people in their 80s and 90s get out of bed in the morning and go on the train and on the bus and in the car to go and teach our children. Thank you for those miles. Thank you for writing your books. Thank you for making the documentaries which enrich our lives. Thank you for making those films. Most of all, thank you for opening your hearts. You have absolutely no reason to do so, and yet you allow us into your life, the most traumatic and horrific place of your life, and with such vulnerability and such dignity, you give us hope. Thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for being the standard bearers for ethics in our world. Thank you for standing against denial and giving us the tools to fight it. Without your words, without your courage, we would be defeated by this, but we have your truth, and thank you for the truth, because you are the bearers of truth. And so for me, we've got to stop writing off this group of people, Jonathan, today, and we've got to start to thank them for all that they have given us, and to all the Holocaust survivors who I meet on a daily basis, and for all 52,000 of you that have given your testimonies to the Shoah Foundation, I want to say from myself and from my heart, a profound thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for not only for the beautiful response, but for giving voice to the survivors that without the work of the Shoah Foundation would not be able to, in many cases, share their messages of hope, of resilience, of love with the world, as you've so eloquently put. Rabbi Paley?
Well, thank you for inviting me on this panel. I deeply appreciate it. I want to say what I think directly. In the beginning. I believe this day, this year, next year, the years after, can be a love letter. And that love letter is from one generation to another. As Stephen and Colette and many of the other speakers have said, Holocaust survivors have given us their testimony, their great energy and their vision and courage over many decades now. And we have to tell them we've heard, we listened to it. We got the witness and we put it into our heart, and we're going to tell it to the next generation. And we will remember you. It won't be the end of your generation, will be the end of the generation. We heard the testimony, we heard the witness, and we'll bring it forward. A few things. I first want to say, at least the name of 4 Holocaust survivors who have really impacted me in my life. The first one was Ernie Michel, who was the executive director emeritus, the executive vice president emeritus of UJA Federation of New York, really the architect of UJA and Federation coming together, and my personal hero and mentor, a person even when I say his name, I almost break into tears, a person who's so alive and that I stood really next to the crushed crematorium of Auschwitz with my daughter, who's the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, and who lost her great-grandparents and great-uncles and aunts in Auschwitz, and stood there and showed his courage and his humanity. And Roman Kent, the president of the Auschwitz Committee, International Auschwitz Committee, who was tireless. I stood with him countless times, where he told his story and brought his broad face and courage and commitment to really changing the future direction. And then to a much more modest person, Lucy Brown, who ran the gift shop outside the Dohan Synagogue in Budapest, and sold lace that she would make at night and little souvenirs. But whenever anybody would come to the Dohan Synagogue and sit by her shop, tour guides would say, don't just buy from her, talk to her and hear her story. And she told her story with such depth and such compassion and such resilience, the word that we should use again and again, such resilience, that a whole generation of people met Lucy Brown until her death in 92, just a few months ago. And of course, the fourth one is my father-in-law, Moshe DeBrecher from Pruzhana, Poland, who brought me my delightful wife, Annie DeBrecher, my 3 children, and my grandchild, and even another one on the way, and who took his all 96 years. He lives right now in Melbourne, Australia, and he lives in the community of Melbourne, Australia, of the Polish Holocaust survivors, and Sydney of the mostly more Hungarian Holocaust survivors. And they fashioned a society that could have been just bitter and angry and closed. And it was instead a society of memory and of understanding and of witness and of celebration. I have not always heard the stories of all the Holocaust survivors in Melbourne, Australia, but I have danced with the survivors of the Holocaust in Melbourne, Australia. I want to say one more thing, a more complex thing. You know, when the first and second temple were destroyed, we have 3 days in the Jewish calendar in which we remember them. We have the 10th of Tevet, the beginning of the destruction of the first temple. We have the 17th of Tammuz, which is the beginning of the destruction, and it's really this Sunday, of the second temple, and Yom and Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in which both temples were destroyed. We have not had, even in the Crusades, even in the expulsion from Spain, we have not had an event at that level in Jewish history until the Shoah. But in the Shoah, we did have an event that should have changed or even cracked Jewish history. And how will we remember it? Yosef Yerushalmi wrote a book called Zachor. And in Zachor, he says, we are not people that believe in history. We are people that believe in memory. And the way you fashion, the way you sculpt, the way you enrich, the way you crystallize memory from generation to generation is crucial to who we are. We didn't just have Tisha B'Av, the day of the destruction of the building of the temple, the first and second. We had the days in which the people themselves were confronted. And I feel right now we have Yom HaShoah, which is the day of the Holocaust, and people then read about the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust. we need a day, we need a time in which the memory that we have is also of the people that survived the Holocaust, the people that told us their stories, the people that built families like my father-in-law, Moshe DeBrecher. You know, it took me a long time. My wife tells the story that he was once given a medal for being a Holocaust survivor. And he looked at my wife and he said, why am I a hero? I just survived. What was the alternative? I was a partisan. I lived in the forest. And it took us a long time to see just how heroic he was, just how resilient, just how strong and committed he was. And so this, in Yiddish, the Shoah is called the Dritte Chorban, the third destruction. And what will we do to remember it? We can't just have the day of where we think about the camps. We also have to have a day about the people who build humble lives, like Moshe DeBrecher and Lucy Broad, not just the great overarching personalities like Ernie Michel and Roman Kent, but the average everyday people that rebuilt their lives and rebuilt our world and changed the narrative of the Jewish community going into the future.
Thank you, Michael. Ulrika, when I remember I first talked to you about this idea, and you know, I wasn't sure if it, you know, if it was such a good idea, and a few people I went to very early and asked them, and you were one of those, and you loved the idea right away, and you said it was important. Why for you? Why for you a Holocaust Survivor Day?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel. It's a real honor to be on. Look, there is a sense of great urgency, given that our time with our survivors is a race against time. It's incumbent on us to not only celebrate and honor the survivors, but also to reassure you, the survivors, that we will carry on your legacies. Who would have thought that you would have to yet again experience such a rise of anti-Semitism, and in many cases relive the trauma? We have an obligation. I feel a strong sense of obligation to reassure you that we will do everything in our power to help combat anti-Semitism and to never forget what you went through. And for the Jewish people at large, and really the whole world, we can never cease to educate and to bring awareness of the vulnerable survivors in our midst, and to address the fact that 40% of survivors in New York alone live in poverty. We all have a responsibility to improve your already compromised lives. Out of 35,000 survivors in the New York area, close to 15,000 live in poverty. And of course, the pandemic has isolated and deepened the needs even further. Hopefully, the goal is that the Holocaust Survivor Day will shed a light on all the issues facing our survivors and encourage people to learn more and to get involved with the many organizations that support and help them, such as the UJA of New York, Jewish Federation, Self-Help, Met Council, and many more. And so I thank all of the work that's done by those organizations. And I pledge that I will do everything that I can to teach my children, for them to teach their children, and we will never forget your stories. You're inspiring, and we love you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrika. And that was, you know, when we had this idea for a Survivor Day, and of course we wanted to celebrate them, to honor them, but one of the ideas really that we hoped would be, one of the results would be that it would, by shining a light on the survivors, it would help communities where there are survivors in need, and there are many. This would maybe help to raise resources for them. And you talk about all the good work being done by different organizations where you are in New York, but the needs are great, and let's hope that we'll be able to not only thank them and celebrate them and honor them, but where they need help to actually make sure that they can live the rest of their lives with dignity and honor and comfort. Colette, I wanted to come back to you and sort of following up a little bit about what Ulrika just said. I wanted to ask you really the state of the survivors in Israel today. What is being done just to take care of them? And you touched on this a little bit, which was the very complicated relationship that Israel and its founding had with survivors. And you really made some amazing points, and I can't wait to rewatch this and unpack a lot of what you said. But do you feel that Israel has moved past, one, what is Israel doing? Is enough being done in Israel for the survivors? And has Israel moved past this original discomfort, almost embarrassment with the survivors, didn't know how really to fit into this Zionist narrative of rebirth and heroism, which I think the survivors are the biggest emblem of that. So can you address that very briefly?
Yes, I think the attitude has changed over the years. I think one of the turning points was the Ahman trial. This is when, for the first time, many Israelis were, in fact, exposed and started understanding. But it took many more years for the government to change its attitude. I was a member of the Israeli Knesset, and I remember in the year 2000 when I came to speak, or 2001, when I came to speak to the then Minister of Finance, and I'm not going to say who he was, you will have to guess, he looked at me and he said, "Why should we do? It's not we didn't do it, it's up to the Germans." And I said, it may not be your guilt, but it is your responsibility. And I think that since then, with all the work that we have done, and believe me, there have been demonstrations and a lot of actions that were taken, I think the attitude started changing in 2007 with Prime Minister Olmert, and it definitely changed in the year 2014 with Yair Lapid, who was then Minister of Finance. Now the Israeli government is investing, giving whatever the budget for Holocaust survivors and for the various programs is about 6 billion Israeli shekel, which is about, let's say, 2 billion, almost $2 billion per year. And I see that the attitude has changed. There's an authority for the rights of the Holocaust survivors that is really doing an effort to include more and more groups of Holocaust survivors to get whatever compensation and medical care. And now, for instance, the dental care is given also. So there are many programs, day centers and welfare at home and people who visit them. After the corona, about 70,000 Holocaust survivors were visited in their homes to find out what they needed. The whole Israeli society was there to go to their homes and bring food and bring whatever was necessary. We got thousands of phone calls. So I said that I think, and most important, I think the younger generation has a lot of compassion, has a lot of admiration, and they all want to work with Holocaust survivors. So I think that working and dealing and listening to Holocaust survivors, in my view, is even more educational than taking them to a trip to Auschwitz. I think this is really important. And as long as they are there, we are continuing to do. Now, obviously, you ask me today, yes, the attitude has changed. The Israeli government is doing a lot. Is it enough? No. We still have 60,000 Holocaust survivors who live in some degree of poverty. They're the people who came from the former Soviet Union. They are not considered, neither by the Germans, not by ourselves, I mean by the state of Israel, as full-fledged Holocaust survivors, but flight cases. So those are still the people to whom we need to give a lot of care, a lot of possibilities to live in dignity, and certainly a lot of dignity.
Thank you, and you are really leading the way with that. And I think the survivors couldn't have a better advocate in Israel than Colette Avital. And this, I think, we all understand.
Jonathan, I didn't choose it. It just chose me. What can I tell you? I went into the Knesset with the idea of doing something completely different, and they came and they asked for my help. And from that day on, this is what I've been doing.
Listen, the lives we lead are not always the lives we choose.
Correct.
But I'm happy that you are where you are, and so are the survivors. Stephen, a question for you. The Shoah Foundation is leading the way in preserving testimony and taking really the particular, and this especially lately what you've been doing in terms of genocide prevention, but taking the particular of the Shoah and using it to look really at the universal of the genocide. Can you talk a little bit about how you do that, about how you use the Dimensions in Testimony project and how you use the stories of the survivors to prevent genocide. Particularly, as you know, I'm a huge fan of the Dimensions in Testimony project, which other people might know as the hologram, using this hologram, but the official name, I think, is the Dimensions in Testimony. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Obviously, the USC Shoah Foundation's archive contains about 52,000 testimonies of Jewish survivors of the Shoah. All of those people are in the archive because they experienced lethal, genocidal anti-Semitism within their lifetime and were targeted for mass murder. So each of them, in their own way, contributes to our understanding of, first of all, how anti-Semitism as a genocidal hatred works, and we need to make sure we understand that very well. Secondly, they give us a guide to human nature. I did a survey of about 1,000 testimonies. At the end of this program, I'll share just a few snippets of what we call our future message question. It's the last question we ask Holocaust survivors. What is your message for the future? I looked at 1,000 of those, all different language groups from all around the world. And what became very clear from their answers in those future messages is two things. First of all, they are giving their testimony as a memory for their lost families. And they want to ensure that in the future, that memory is maintained through their testimony. Secondly, and very prominently, they're giving their testimony in order to warn the world and to live to a better standard. And it was very, very clear across these 1,000 testimonies that those were the two principal reasons why they gave us their testimony. I wanted to check that, Jonathan, because I want to make sure if we as the Shoah Foundation were going to use their testimony in broader education around preventing genocide and tackling intolerance in our world, that it was actually part of what they intended when they gave their testimonies. And I can tell you unequivocally, that's how they want their testimonies to be used, that their families not be forgotten and that their testimonies are used to reduce genocide and hatred within our world. So, in all of our programs going forward, we therefore took that and said, how do we then apply that in the world in which we live? So we did, in fact, broaden the collection of the Shoah Foundation. We now have 10 different genocides. Many of those survivors of genocides other than the Holocaust come to us because of the courage of the Shoah survivors. They want to tell their stories because they can see that it's valuable to do so, and there's no competition of suffering. We have a very important principle. Human suffering should never be compared. Its causes and consequences must be. Because if we compare the causes of genocide, we have a better chance of preventing it for others. And that, by the way, includes future generations of Jews, as Roman Kent was saying that Ron Lauder mentioned earlier. Now, Dimensions in Testimony, which some people misleadingly call the Hologram Project, actually is a dialogue project. We saw that Holocaust survivors are providing a very important point of contact with young people in particular, going into the many museums that there are. I see a number of our museum directors here on the call today, and thank you for all you do in the Holocaust museums around the world to create dialogue. I also see Hank Greenspan is on from Michigan. Hank wrote a very good book in the 1990s called On Listening to Holocaust Survivors, and I quoted it copiously in my PhD because what I understood was from Hank's work that dialogue is the basis of understanding. So the Dimensions in Testimony project takes the questions that people ask of Holocaust survivors and creates the possibility of continuing to ask them long into the future in a conversational way. Why is that important? Because actually, education that's driven by curiosity is more sticky. It has better results. Secondly, it develops a deeper empathy with the story itself. Now, it doesn't mean that any of the 52,000 testimonies have a less value as a result of this. What it means is we have a different form of testimony that we can use in future. And we're so grateful to the now 35 survivors that have given their dialogue, interactive testimonies through Dimensions in Testimony in English, Hebrew, German, Spanish, French, Russian. It's going to be Swedish. It's multiple languages now, so that young people in the future can ask in their own language and get guidance from our Holocaust survivors who are giving most remarkable answers to these complex questions that young people have.
Thank you, Stephen. It's remarkable. For whoever hasn't seen the Dimensions in Testimony live, it is absolutely a remarkable thing. Ulrika, I want to ask you just something that you are involved in the museum in Amsterdam and the museum being built in Stockholm. And obviously the Holocaust Museum in Europe has its own special power because of what happened here in Europe. How do you see the role of those museums in Europe, and what is the role that survivors will play in those museums in Amsterdam and will play in Stockholm? And if you could be really, really brief, that would be great. And sorry.
I could talk about that for hours, so that won't happen. I'll try to be brief. Those two museums that I'm involved with, one underway in Amsterdam and Stockholm, are by nature very different from each other. However, in both cases, they have government support. In the case of Amsterdam, where 85% of the Jews fell victim to the Shoah, there has been lots of financial support, not only from the Dutch government, but also the German government, Claims Conference, and the Dutch Railroad and others. In Sweden, a country not occupied by the Nazis, but where approximately 10,000 survivors were rescued from the concentration camps in 1945. And they were placed in DP camps throughout the country. Those Jews, they infused life into a highly secular and assimilated community. And many became leaders and pillars. And then when another wave of Jews came from Poland in 1968, escaping a hostile government, was a real renewal of Jewish life, if you will. So there in Sweden, it is the survivors who have been the driving force and the impetus for the recent development behind the Holocaust Museum, viewed from, with a Swedish lens, with the support of some amazing leaders, and a prime minister and minister of education who were deeply moved by a 2015 highly successful exhibit featuring survivors' experiences before, during, and after the war. And this exhibit has been, it's been a remarkable experience, and it's been a collaboration with the USC Shoah Foundation. Stephen has been there many times, as well as the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. In the Netherlands, a few survivors returned, but many hidden children remained. And so they were often orphaned and grew up not knowing their Jewish identity. And so it's a very different project. There, it is driven by the fact that there are actual buildings and sites of atrocities in the heart of Amsterdam. And the effort is spearheaded by the Jewish Cultural Quarter, who has brought a diverse spectrum of leaders on board who have a sense that the Dutch are finally ready to face their role and dark history vis-a-vis the Jews in World War II. It's a very painful process, I think, for the Dutch. Such a thriving, huge Jewish community up until 1940, and really where Jews lived well, and where German Jews would flee all the way up until 1938. And then in 1940, it all changed. And so anyway, so this is going to be a historic museum in many state-of-the-art, really interesting. And it's set to open its doors in early 2023. And like I said, there's so much more to say about these projects. I'm very excited about them both. But I'll leave it at that for now. We can have a whole webinar just about those.
I'd love to do it. Thank you, Ulrika. Michael, Rabbi Paley, nobody else in the world I would ask this of, but you, I will ask this of you. In 2 minutes, Michael Paley, how should the Jewish world remember the Holocaust and the survivors? Ooh. 2 minutes.
The first time I came to the JCC of Krakow, I had just been to Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is just a terrible place to visit. And when I came to the JCC of Krakow, I felt the pain of Auschwitz almost on my clothes, almost on the soles of my feet. And when we came into the JCC, we found a place of tremendous life. We found a place of real joy, and people really were Holocaust survivors and children together. And I said to myself, this is a really live place in the middle of Kazimierz in old Krakow. And I said to myself that this is doing something no less than changing the Jewish narrative. We used to think that Passover was about creation, and Sukkot and Shavuot was about revelation, and that Sukkot was about redemption, going home, being saved. But I realized that there was another step in there, and that was revival, coming back to life, resilience. And if you can revive Jewish life in Krakow, Poland, where you can ride a bicycle from Auschwitz, you can pretty much revive it anywhere in the world. there's one more short thought. In Budapest, where my wife and I live, there's a monument to the war that the Hungarian government put up, and it's of a German eagle attacking a Hungarian victim. And the Holocaust survivors said, no, that's the wrong memory. It's not right. So they put a piece of barbed wire across from the memorial, and they put all of their suitcases, memorabilia, newspaper articles, all sorts of things, and they sat there. And they said, we're going to tell you the truth. We're going to tell you the truth of what happened, and we're going to tell you the truth of our own revival. And when they sat there and they said that we know that Passover is, one person said to me, we know that Passover is about creation. We know that Shavuot is about revelation. But our life is about going home and making the whole world a home for ourselves. For those survivors to be able to say we live at home in the whole world again after this terrible destruction, that's enough of a memory to last decades and centuries, and I hope even millennia, that this world will be a home that we'll all feel good in, that we'll all feel has revived, that we'll all feel that we will never, like all the other people say, we'll never be sucked into again. That's a dream, it's a hope, and I believe that the memory of the Holocaust survivors in the future can make it into a reality.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Michael. Stephen, I understand that you've brought us some a very exciting present from the Shoah Foundation, that you've created a couple films that you'd like to introduce.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. We just thought it was so important at the end of our session today to hear from the survivors themselves. So obviously when Steven Spielberg created the Shoah Foundation in 1994, when he went up to receive the Oscar for Schindler's List, he said there are over 300,000, I don't think you knew exactly what the number was, but over 300,000 survivors that are out there, and they are our teachers. Let's listen to them and let's ensure that that they become our teachers. And that started the program, which resulted in the Shoah Foundation's collection. And here we are, 25 years later, and they are still teaching us. So I have a little message from Steven Spielberg today, and also a little reel from survivors, by the way, that gave their testimonies 25 years ago from the Shoah Foundation, also our partners like the Azrieli Foundation and the Jewish Family Children's Services and many other organizations around the world that are all collected together now at the Shoah Foundation. We're going to see a few clips of what they said 25 years ago. All of the survivors you see in this reel are still there, out there today on their Zooms, calling, teaching our children, and a part of our community. And that's just another way to say thank you for leaving your testimony, and thank you for all that you do today.
Hello, everyone, and I'm so honored to join you for the first ever Holocaust Survivor Day, which to me is a long overdue celebration of living witnesses, many of whom I've had the pleasure of knowing throughout my life. Since we founded Shoah Foundation back in 1994, I have always believed the survivors are our teachers, but the responsibility of passing on the lessons of their testimonies lies with all of us. Their bravery has been captured in our archive, but we always need to find new ways to ensure these stories are told again and again from generation to generation. That's why it is just a joy for me to see more than 60 organizations come together today to celebrate the bravery, the sacrifices, the lives of the most courageous people I've ever known. So once again, I'm so honored to be part of today's program, and thank you all for your work in creating yet another way for us to carry this history forward. L'chaim.
We're now just going to see a few short testimony clips to end our program.
Don't hate. Try to live with your neighbor. Accept people for what they are.
You have to stop feeling superior to another human being just because that human being has a different color skin, a different shape of eyes, or a different religion than yours.
Bridges have to be built. One has to speak to each other again, or it will end badly again.
Try to understand each other. And if you cannot love each other, at least respect each other.
to have integrity and honesty in your dealings with people. That's what's important.
We as witnesses, we sort of have to, we're handing this over to them, so in essence, they become witnesses themselves.
I now carry a torch, like an Olympic torch, a torch of goodwill, camaraderie, acceptance of human beings, and I would like to hand that torch over to them, and I would like them to make sure that there's no bullying, there's no disrespect, that that torch will illuminate them and will make them feel that everyone is somebody to treasure.
Don't take people for granted. Don't take a situation for granted. I heard here not too long ago from a few youngsters that told me, Mr. Wren, we're in the United States. It can't happen here. That's bullshit. In the early 30s, those are the exact same words that the Jewish kids in Germany used. They said that it can't happen there.
For me, anything I do today is who I am. Anything I am has to do with what, not just what happened to me, but who I was then. And to know that it's not about me, and I don't have to carry the guilt anymore, that what was happened to me, that yes, I was a victim. And today, I'm a survivor.
Incredible. Incredibly powerful. Thank you. Thank you to the Shoah Foundation, Stephen, for bringing that. Thank you to Steven Spielberg for the beautiful words. Thank you, Ulrika, Stephen, Colette, Michael, all who joined us. And thank you, of course, first and foremost, to the survivors. And may we continue to carry the torch that they've lit and use their light and shine it throughout all the dark corners of the world. And may this Holocaust Survivor Day not be the first, and may we continue to learn from them, to love them, and to celebrate them. Thank you.